I've heard members of the government who support this legislation say it's important not to label people, and who have then turned around and labelled opponents of this bill as extremists or fringe. That means the gay mum of a young girl who contacted me in opposition to this bill, according to Labor members opposite, is an extremist or a fringe element of the community and shouldn't be listened to. That means other parents who are genuinely concerned for the rights of their young female children are worried that they won't have any support if they raise concerns about biological men having access to women's toilets. That means others who've raised a range of issues, genuine issues about this legislation, will have Labor government members saying don't listen to them, that they're fringe and they're extremist. And I would put to this House, if we are truly going to be tolerant and listen genuinely to the different voices, those sorts of labels are going to shut down the very people who need not only to be heard, but in many circumstances also need our support and protection. Because people's lived experience, their lived experience where they may have faced violence, domestic violence, security issues around their personal space should not be ignored because Labor government members have said they're extremists or fringe. I've heard the government and the Attorney-General say, well, they don't believe there is evidence to back up concerns about people's fears for having biological men have access to women's safe spaces. But they're simply not listening. They're not listening to the many women who have lived experiences and where they have faced genuine issues around perpetrators who have taken away their ability to feel safe, who have a genuine need, as many women in our community do, to women-safe spaces. This government isn't listening because they are hypocrites. They preach tolerance and then they practice intolerance. Having compassion and understanding for transgender people and gender dysphoric children is important. But how to achieve that should not come at the expense of women's rights, and that's where this bill fails. Women have had to fight for their rights over the generations for women-only spaces and services for good reason. Today, this state Labor government undermines the rights of women by providing for gender self-ID in this bill, where a biological man can self-ID as a woman, with cascading impacts when read in combination with anti-discrimination laws. This state Labor government is ignoring the voices of women from diverse political and social backgrounds who have expressed genuine concerns that this bill undermines the fundamental rights of women, particularly for women to have women-only spaces and services. The correspondence I've received is from across the spectrum of backgrounds, from a variety of ideological backgrounds, people who you might say may not always have common ideology, but they share a common concern with this legislation. As I've mentioned, I've had constituents, gay constituents who've contacted me who want this bill opposed and have expressed their concern. I have had straight people who've also expressed their concerns, and, as I said, from across the spectrum of backgrounds, and, as I appreciate, very different backgrounds. But why don't their voices count when we listen to Labor members want to label them and say they shouldn't be heard? Women have a right to be safe. They also have a right to feel safe. And that's what's been fundamentally missing from a lot of the defence the government's put up for bringing this forward. Because not only do you have the right to be safe, you have the right to feel safe. As we know, people who have lived experiences where they haven't been safe, to then be told that they have to put up or else be labelled as being intolerant. They have to put up with a biological man accessing safe women's spaces, women-only spaces. That just doesn't cut it. It doesn't make them feel safe. to have others on the other side say, well, they should feel safe because we're going to quote this and that studies. Well, there are other studies that would dispute the claims of the government, but there is no dispute of a woman's right to feel safe. And that's why I particularly speak strongly on behalf of those diverse constituents who've put forward their concerns to me. Having a biological man who is self-ID'd as a woman or claims they identify as a woman, accessing women's safe spaces such as women's toilets or jails, well, women's-only jails or DV shelters, I believe is a risk to women's safety and a risk, as I've said, to the right to feel safe that they are in a women's-only space. If you've ever talked to women who have faced abuse or violence, their right to feeling safe matters as much as being safe. This right, and this has been totally ignored and belittled by some of the government's dismissals of women's concerns. Why doesn't the government get this? Dismissing women's concerns about their safety is like blaming women, putting it on them and saying it's your fault if you have concerns about your safety. Somehow their fault, and downplaying their very real concerns. And I've heard nothing from the Attorney-General that in any way provides the safeguards or the satisfaction to those very real concerns. Biological men in women's-only spaces is not okay, and this bill will make it harder for women to have those rights respected going forward after what I've heard from Labor members opposite. There is also the issue around girls' sport and a range of other matters. Now, as I've said, we do need to have compassion and understanding for children, particularly gender dysphoric children, and how they are best supported. But this bill is not the way to achieve that. I want to quote from some letters I've received from constituents. And it does concern me that their views somehow aren't on the agenda of this government. And this particular constituent said, for every law-abiding transsexual, transgender person, there are probably many more non-transgender predators who would love this legislation in order to get access to women's spaces. You may think that this is unlikely, but just consider the obsessive forces driving pedophiles and many sex offenders and voyeurs, and maybe you can comprehend that they are quite prepared to do a bit of pretence to get what they want. Most of these people would never make any use of the legislation to actually change their birth certificate, but once you make it known that changing gender involves really nothing more than self-declaration, it changes the culture. It makes it seem acceptable for men to use the women's change rooms, for example, merely by saying they feel womanly. Predators will be quite prepared to pretend to be women in order to seek out their prey, be they women or children. This has already been seen in regions that are further along this track. And this letter goes on. The current gender ideology dogma has become that for a man to be a woman, they do not necessarily need hormones or surgery or anything. They don't actually even need to make any attempt to look like a woman. Just a self-declaration of womanliness is enough to truly be a woman and to allow free access to spaces that are currently reserved for women and girls. Can you appreciate the safeguarding problems here? End quote. To also quote from another constituent, a gay mum of a young girl who said, sex self-ID would be disastrous for women and girls. We essentially lose all female-only spaces as self-ID means any male could self-declare a special identity and without having undergone any surgery or hormone treatment, gain access to all spaces designed for females only. Another letter goes on to quote, the argument that this won't happen cannot be made. The things I've cited, I'm quoting from this letter, above have happened around the world. Many of these events are not rare. A major objection, and it just goes on, people making rational objections to this legislation will predictably be smeared as being transphobic and bigoted. It is not transphobic or
Speaker.
bigoted to be concerned.
Member, time's expired.
These are my constituents who've been
Member,
writing.
time has expired.